Okay, welcome everybody. This is going to be the second of our three-part Lev Ha'ir, Heart of the City series on foundational ideas from the diaspora about Jewish safety. This is part two. Welcome also to the people who are watching it after the fact on the recording. I usually start with a moment of visual access, but now I'm spotlighted, so I can't even see the whole group. But I think we have, I don't know, maybe 20-ish people in this Zoom. Yes, and really good to see everybody. And we're going to start with our Torah learning blessing. As I always say, it is the same as the candle lighting blessing, but it ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. Please join me. Baruch Eloheinu Asher kitshanu v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you for the inspiration to immerse ourselves in lifelong learning. Amen.
Rabbi Julie, do you want me to mute everybody and they can unmute when they want to?
Yeah, probably, because we'll be toggling a little bit back and forth.
Okay, so I'm going to do that now, and you will need to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Really good. Okay, well, just a very brief review of where we've been. We already talked in our first session about three different overall strategies that the Jewish people has taken to attempt to ensure safety for our people. The first one was to be part of a society or to co-create a society that is tolerant and accepting of diversity. And we noticed that that included the ancient Greek and Roman societies that really didn't care what religion or ethnicity you were. Everyone was basically tolerant, and that helped the Jews. But it also includes the last basically 250 years of modern American society, where there's been a continual development of human rights, civil rights, and a society based on law. Some of that is currently being threatened. But that's the first strategy for staying safe, is to be part of something where everybody gets to be safe and tolerated. The second strategy is to cozy up to the most powerful rulers of the time. This is a tried and true Jewish strategy. It was used frequently and in many different geographic areas under Christian and Muslim rule throughout the Middle Ages. And we also noted that it's a very contemporary dynamic as people bend the knee in the Jewish community to Trump, whether it's law firms or universities. And we also notice where that strategy is being challenged. And then the third strategy, which developed late in the 19th century, late in the 1800s, was to work for the creation and sustenance of a nation state that belongs to Jews, which resulted in the nation state of Israel. Those are the three strategies we looked at. Today, we're going to complexify our understanding about Jewish safety. And we're going to move beyond just those three strategies. As we learned in the first class of the series, the third strategy is known as political Zionism. Many people just truncate that to say Zionism. But there are also other kinds of Zionism. And today you probably hear people saying things like, I'm a Zionist, I'm an anti-Zionist, I'm a non-Zionist. And we really should always ask, what does that mean to you? Because today what we're going to learn about is non-political Zionism, which is sometimes also called spiritual Zionism or ethical Zionism or cultural Zionism. And that is also a tried and true and pretty ancient form of Zionism. So we kind of need to add an adjective. Political Zionism is the idea that there should be a nation state to keep the Jews safe, that the Jews need a nation. That's a relatively very new idea in the grand scheme of Judaism. Like, we never really, for thousands of years, had the idea that to be a Jewish people, we needed a geographic nation with borders and a government and to own our own state. Until Herzl and the Zionists, the political Zionists of the late 19th century, and then into the first decades of the 20th century until the state of Israel was born. And once again, now, many Jewish leaders are questioning, do you need to have a nation in order to have Judaism and the Jewish people thrive? Like, what is the relationship between safety, Judaism, the people, and a nation? That is now once again being questioned. For some of the deepest thinkers in Judaism, Zionism was first and foremost about a moral and spiritual and ethical revolution. And so we're going to be asking, along with those leaders today, what is the purpose of the Jewish people? And what does it mean for the Jewish people to live well, not just to live safely? What trade-offs are we willing to make? So our historical context is still the same as last time. It's the 19th and late 19th and early 20th century in Eastern and Central Europe, where these thinkers that we are studying today lived. In our third of the three-part series, we'll be looking at a thinker based in the United States who is alive to this day, Shaul Magid. Because in that same context that where Herzl emerged, also emerged this modern concept of cultural Zionism. And today we are studying Ahad Ha'am and Martin Buber. Ahad Ha'am called his version of Zionism cultural Zionism, and Martin Buber called it dialogical Zionism, which kind of means relational Zionism. Both of these thinkers came from elite, well-to-do families. They both came from Ukraine, where so many of our Jewish ancestors came from. And their work was very much in response to Herzl's political Zionist movement, although it certainly connected with strands of earlier Judaism that also were spiritual and culturally connected to the Holy Land, but it was not about a nation state. So together, both of them believed that there needed to be not territory first, but an ethical and spiritual renewal of the Jewish people. And they both asked, can a Jewish state exist without a Jewish spirit? Big question. Neither of them was really against Jews moving to Palestine. They both supported Jews moving to Palestine, but they did not see just the movement of Jews to Palestine as any kind of a solution. So we're going to dive first into the work of Ahad Ha'am, who was born as Asher Ginzberg in 1856. So kind of during, and lived to live till 1927. So basically overlapping with Herzl's lifetime. And he was an intellectual who wrote and studied and was not particularly religious. He was more of what we would call a secular Jew, but very rooted in a world where he was certainly familiar with deep enactment of Jewish practices. And he reacted against Herzl's political Zionism because he felt it was just too pragmatic. It was too focused on kind of diplomacy and geography and not enough on the spiritual purpose of the Jews. Like, we could put all the Jews, well, actually, he did not think we could put all the Jews into Palestine. But even if we could put all the Jews into Palestine, what then? That was not at all the purpose. Just being safe was not the purpose of being Jewish. He lived at a time when Jews in general were not safe, but there were two different kinds of not safeness. And we know that all of these issues were called the Jewish problem all over Europe, both Western and Eastern Europe. And the Jewish problem was considered both by Jewish leaders and thinkers who recognize there's a big problem here, and also by the dominant societies who thought there was a Jewish problem. And in the West, the Jewish problem from the point of view of the dominant societies, which Ahad Ha'am names, was that the Jews just wouldn't assimilate well enough. The Jews were supposed to become equal citizens. Like here they were emancipating us and granting us freedom and participation. And we didn't do, in their minds, a good enough job of it because we actually wanted to be Jewish. We didn't want to totally assimilate. And as many leaders noticed, including Hahad Ha'am, those dominant governments were very willing to give endless rights to individual Jews, but none to Jewish communities. Like Judaism was not respected, not encouraged, although each individual Jew could vote and could, be protected under the law as an individual citizen. So starting in 1789, these ideas resulted in the actual emancipation of the Jews, starting in France. And this was the emancipation connected to sort of an Enlightenment feeling that all people should be equal, everybody should get to be a citizen. In Hebrew, that concept was called the Haskalah. That was the intellectual movement of emancipation. And both Jewish and non-Jewish thinkers were kind of wrestling with what does emancipation mean for the Jews? This is the Jewish problem. So from the dominant society point of view, Jews wouldn't assimilate enough. But from within Judaism, what Ahad Ha'am recognizes was the problem is that Jews kind of longed to assimilate, but it didn't work out very well from the Jewish side because Jews, but first of all, wanted to have some connection to Judaism and their roots, but second of all, wanted to assimilate more than actually worked culturally. So Jews were always kind of different and other. And actually, Ahad Ha'am does not talk a huge amount about this, but what was happening was that thousands and thousands of Jews were just simply converting to Christianity because it would make life easier. They could succeed more if they nominally became Christian. And so thousands and thousands of Jews just were leaving Jewish community out of, kind of convenience to succeed better in the dominant society now that they had access to it. So in the West, the problem was in relationship to assimilation. How did Jews and how did the dominant society handle emancipation? And it wasn't going well from either point of view. Now, the Enlightenment and emancipation slowly rolled across Europe, starting in the West and ending up in the East, in places that a lot of our ancestors came from. And so the East came to Enlightenment and especially to emancipation way later than the West. So the West, it's around the late 1700s, the French Revolution, 1789, kind of the big landmark. But by contrast, in the East, the Jewish problem was a different problem because people were still very deeply rooted in very traditional Jewish communities. And, political Zionism was being born, but the Eastern European Jews' main problem was they were living in terrible poverty and with terrible persecution. They weren't allowed to assimilate, so that wasn't a threat from either direction. The dominant society didn't think they weren't doing it well enough, and the Jews weren't scared of assimilation because it just wasn't an issue. You couldn't assimilate. It was still the old way of Jews being a subject, minimally tolerated minority communities. But at the same time, those Eastern European Jews were nourished by Judaism because they actually were learned and they actually practiced Judaism. They were nourished by Judaism in a way that the Western Jews weren't. And so conversion was way less of a threat. They didn't think they could be Christian, and there wasn't really a welcome. There was no opportunity associated with converting to Christianity. And also, they were very well nourished in Jewish community because Judaism is pretty amazing. It's very nourishing when you actually have a community and practice it. So still in Eastern Europe, it was the home of the great Litvak and Hasidic Rebbes. So Judaism was like very alive and well in those places. The Litvak ones were the Talmudic ones that debated every little thing, but it was sort of creative and intellectual, and they were very literate, especially the men. But it was also the home of the Hasidic dynasties who were inventing sort of very emotionally rooted, alive, vibrant. They were, in many ways, the first psychotherapists. Like they really brought Judaism home to the inner life and to understanding the depth of spirituality. We still draw from both of those roots, and they were thriving in Eastern Europe. But there was incredible poverty amongst the Jews because they weren't, I mean, basically it was an agricultural world, and the Jews weren't allowed to have land and weren't part of the agricultural world. And there wasn't really much else because industrialization was very slow to come to those places. So there was terrible poverty. And there also were terrible threats to body and limb. This is the land of Fiddler on the Roof, constant expulsions, and um, a lot of oppression, West and in the East. And he speaks to both of them, some in the material that we read. For the Western people, what they really needed was a revival of Judaism. They did not need a safe place to go because they were pretty physically safe in Western Europe. They had rights and there was anti-Semitism, but it was more kind of about not being fully respected. You were a little bit less than, but you weren't going to be killed. And um, you didn't need to go migrate to find a safe place to live. So what you really needed was a kind of cultural, spiritual reinfusion of the Jewish spirit into your life and your world's life. And he did think, Ahad Ha'am thought that that could happen if there were a center of Jewish living and learning in Palestine. It did not have to be a state, but it could be like a kind of concentrated revival of Judaism in connection to the modern world. Like he was an educated modern person. He came from an elite family. He had a really good Western education, as well as um, he lived in a place where he was connected to Jewish roots as well. So he wanted Judaism to kind of modernize and be part of the current intellectual currents of the day, which wasn't happening in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe's Judaism was still as it had basically been practiced for 2,000 years. And he thought that could come from having a Jewish, like very vibrant, amazing spiritual cultural center in Palestine. It did not matter if it had national borders. That wasn't the point. A state wasn't what he, kind of identified as what was needed. And for the people in Eastern Europe, what they did need was physical material safety. But he realized that you would never be able to take all the millions of Jews from Eastern Europe and transplant them in Palestine. I'm going to give you the numbers in a minute because you'll agree with him. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, to escape from the terrible, terrible, brutal conditions there, a lot of what was happening was emigration. And it was during these years that thousands, tens of thousands, millions of Jews left Eastern Europe, many of whom were our ancestors. They were my ancestors. And they migrated mostly to the United States, which between 1880 and 1924 had open borders and welcomed immigrants. So I'm going to give the numbers in just a minute, but can we go back to community view for a minute, Bobby? Please. Bobby, are we on community view? Oh, I still I'm seeing just me here. Is there something else that I need to do?
All right. Wait a minute.
Can everybody see everybody here? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of be able to see who I'm talking to here. Just footnote here, I mentioned last time that the Education Committee had given really constructive feedback about wanting to try something different in our education series of more of a frontal kind of lecture, not so interactive and participatory process for this particular series. And so I'm going to be speaking a lot. You can hear I'm kind of a talking head here. But I do want to take some breaks and just kind of hear from people and see if there are questions and we will have some time for discussion at the end. But this is mostly going to be a teaching session, not a participation session. We have great participation time with Shamanu every week at 11 for members. So there will be space for everything. And this is a lecture, basically. Hopefully it's an interesting lecture. Does anybody at this point have a comment or question before we go deeper into this material? Okay, Bobby, let's go back to, I just like to kind of take the pulse there. Wonderful. Okay, so we're dealing with threats of assimilation, threats of migration, threats of conversion, and threats of physical death, basically, through pogroms and everything. So all of these things are threatening the Jewish community. Some of them are drivers of the danger, some of them are responses to the danger, but it's a really hard time for the Jews in both Western and Eastern Europe. So just to kind of enlarge Ahad Ha'am's thinking about this, the Western Jews needed a spiritual revival, not a new piece of land. The Eastern Jews did need physical safety, but it wasn't realistic to move all of them to Israel. And in the meantime, Judaism in Eastern Europe's not thriving in its contact with the modern world. So again, everybody, according to Ahad Ha'am, needs a strong spiritual center of its own to kind of bolster Judaism and protect the Jewish people, mostly the Eastern European Jewish people. So he proposed that the land of Israel become a spiritual center, a merkaz ruchani, because ruach, you can hear the word ruach, spirit. Merkaz means center, a merkaz ruchani, a spiritual center for world Judaism. Not all Jews would live there, but all would look to it for ethical and cultural inspiration. And if you think about it, every time we take the Torah out of the ark in traditional Judaism, which we still actually do often do this, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. So what we're basically saying is from Zion goes forth Torah. And that was his idea. Let's do that. Like let's have a spiritual center, and from Zion in Palestine, Torah can go forth, and it will be an ethical, spiritual, cultural inspiration to a diaspora where most Jews still live. He wrote, "We must create in Palestine a model society that shall be a light to all Jews and perhaps to all humanity." He warned that a purely political state could become morally empty or even oppressive. Herzl's argument had been that the Jews needed a nation so that we could be like all other people, because every other people had a nation. And by contrast, Ahad Ha'am says, if the Jewish state is only like all other states, then why do we need it at all? He thought Herzl's approach was actually dangerous and not deeply Jewish in moral sensibility. And the question should be not where the Jews should live, but how the Jews should live. So, like I said, he wasn't opposed to Jews moving to Palestine. He was not, but that was not what Zionism meant to him. What Zionism meant that Jews needed continuity in ethical consciousness, moral consciousness, cultural consciousness, not just physical survival. We really ask, like, sort of, what's the purpose of the Jewish people? It's to have a moral ideal expressed in living prophetic ethics. So, another quote, the foundation of our national revival must be in the spirit, the moral and cultural essence of our people. So really the true well-being of the Jews would involve a balance of course, you need physical security, but you also need moral integrity. And one without the other would not be true to Judaism. I identified a quote here on page 267. For those of you who have your handout right there, I'm just going to read from this because I think it says it all. Let's see, 200. Where is this? 267. Okay. At the bottom of the page on 267. From this center, the spirit of Judaism will radiate to a great circumference to all the communities of the diaspora, to inspire them with new life and to preserve the overall unity of our people. When our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that will produce men, people in the land of Israel itself, who will be able, at a favorable moment, to establish a state there, one which will be not merely a state of Jews, but a really Jewish state. So, as you can see, he wasn't opposed to ever having a nation state there. He certainly was in favor of Jews, some Jews moving there, but that wasn't the end of the story. What was more important was the moral and cultural revival, and that be done not as an ancient kind of let's resurrect the temple or the ancient academies, but let's do this in relation to the modern world with the intellectual advances of democracy and a modern intellectual life. Because in Eastern Europe, Judaism was still totally sheltered from the modern world. Like people were not allowed to study in academies. They had to be in non-Jewish academies, like the great universities. Okay, so now let's take a breath because this is a lot. And we're complexifying political Zionism. And we'll move to Martin Buber. Okay, Martin Buber, many of us know his work from a different context because he was a philosopher, a theologian, and a translator of Hasidic tales. And he also actually translated with Franz Rosenzweig the entire Bible into German in 14 volumes because he also wanted Judaism to meet the modern world. And people spoke German in the modern world, not necessarily the ancient languages as this assimilation process took place in Western Europe. So early on, he was a Zionist activist. He actually I think he went to the founding World Zionist Congress, and actually he definitely worked with Herzl. He had a job being the editor for one of Herzl's Zionist newspapers. But he began to be disillusioned by nationalism's moral dangers, as did a lot of people when they saw what happened in World War I, where every nation decided to fight every other nation and millions of people died, and it was just not good. So he was a spokesman for ethical humanist Zionism and one of the big leaders for Arab-Jewish coexistence. So he's actually claimed for many of these range of reasons by the Reconstructing Judaism movement, because in many ways he had a huge influence on the ethical development of the early state. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, was very influenced by Martin Buber. And still today, people who want Jews and Palestinians to live in peace, or Jews and Arabs to live in peace in that geographic area, see him as a founding father of that approach. What some of us know him from is the book I and Thou. We probably should do a whole class on that, but this is what he means by dialogical, that everything's relational. We're all in relationship. And he believed that the I-thou relationship, which is that you really encounter another who is other, and you're each whole human beings, and relationally, that kind of interconnects the whole, all under God. And so he extended that also to the Arabs. He could see that living together with respect and sacred encounter amongst these different kinds of, religions and histories and needs was what was needed. And when he applied that to the concept, to his version of Zionism, he said, we must not become masters in a land of servants. but partners with our neighbors before God. I want to share a quote from page 464 that was moving to me in your handout. You might want to read it along with me, 464. Okay, I think it may start actually on page 4. So let me just get the beginning of the paragraph. Okay, so we considered it a fundamental point that in this case, speaking about Palestine, two vital claims are opposed to each other. Two claims of a different nature and a different origin, which cannot really be pitted against one another. And there's no objective decision that can be made in which the one is just and one's unjust. We considered and still consider it our duty to understand and to honor the claim which is opposed to ours. He's talking about the Jews and the Arabs in that land, who are both Christian and Muslim. And he's talking about their claims, which are opposed to the Jewish claims. And we need to endeavor to reconcile both claims. We could not and cannot renounce the Jewish claim. Something even higher than the life of our people is bound up with this claim, namely its work, its divine mission. But we have been and still are convinced that it must be possible to find some compromise between this claim and the other. For we love this land and we believe in its future. And since such love and such faith are surely present on the other side as well, a union in the common service of the land must be within the range of possibility. Where there is faith and love, a solution may be found even to what appears to be a tragic opposition. I think that's really just amazing that he could put himself into kind of the role of the other, the Arabs who already lived in that land, and see it through their eyes and value that they also had a point of view without giving up his own Jewish commitment and the need for Jews to have a ethical center there. And he also wasn't opposed to a migration at all. He was not opposed. He liked the idea of Jews having an ethical center there, to be a light unto the nations, but it did not have to be a nation. In fact, he actually was against the militaristic and kind of exclusionary tendencies in political Zionism. And instead, it's really interesting because these ideas are being revived today in post October 7th. He envisioned a binational community rooted in justice and dialogue, where there'd be two cultural peoples who would share a state. Everybody could vote. And in terms of demographics, it would be balanced out so that there were basically kind of everybody had to cooperate. You know, I don't know if that's more or less likely as a possibility now, like one nation for everybody in that big land. And I mean, theoretically, he sort of saw that everybody could thrive with that kind of a format. And there are many thinkers today who also think so, maybe not right at this minute when there's so much grief and hatred and fear, but as a future, maybe for the next generation, like after 20 years or something, maybe something like that is very much currently back on the table, a binational one state idea. And another interesting thing about him being, as we are reconstructing Jews and we don't believe in chosen, is he actually saw the Jews as a chosen people. But the chosenness was in the form of a demand by God that Jews live up to the ethical standards of excellence and be this light unto the nation. It had nothing at all to do with requiring national borders, because he strongly believed that all the earth belongs to God. And so national borders are beside the point. And God actually owns all the land. And that's the biblical idea that God owns all the land. It doesn't belong to the Jews, and it also does not belong to the Arabs. We seek not domination, but mutual life with the Arab people in this land, he wrote. And, I think Herzl and the political Zionists, they thought of themselves as more advanced than the people in that land. They thought of themselves sort of as saviors, like our coming is actually going to be good for the Arabs. We're going to colonize them, but it will be good for them. They'll learn to be better farmers. And it was a very kind of they're primitive, and Western Europe will come in and land there, and we're going to kind of save these backward peoples. If anything, they had that the political Zionists had that very noble idea, very noble imperialist idea. And it was true. They had lots of advanced agricultural methods and could, fix the swamps so there wasn't malaria. And that was all true. But the attitude that came with it was imperialist. Like, we're better than you, we'll raise you up. But even more than that, the political Zionists just mostly didn't even see the people who were there. It wasn't that they wanted to dominate anybody. They just did not notice that there were other people who already lived for generations on the land. Martin Buber did notice that there were other people there and was very concerned that we don't want to dominate and we need to have a mutual life. We're all God's children, was how he would theologically narrate it. So let's stop there in the middle of our overview of Martin Buber and do a little check for questions or comments. Can we go to community view, Bobby? Thank you. Okay, it's good to see you all when we switch back like this. I know this is a lot of me talking. Would anybody like to please ask a question or have a turn just speaking to what you see as the issues here, this big mix of,
Fran put a question in the chat.
let me open my chat.
Right after our last
Oh, I didn't see that. Actually, good.
I have a question. It's just a factual question. I noticed that our first object, yes, here we go. Our first people that we studied today, he died in 1927. Were the Jews in Palestine yet at that time?
Oh, good. Let me backtrack. We have two questions. So the first question from Fran is, where was Ahad Ha'am living? Actually, both of these guys were born in Ukraine. Both Ahad Ha'am and Martin Buber were born in Ukraine, had very good Western educations, and migrated to Palestine. It wasn't a nation yet, in their adult lives. They both ended up in Palestine. As you know, Israel was founded in 1948, and before that, it was called the Yishuv, the settlement. So they both migrated to the settlement called the Yishuv of. So it was like Jews living in Palestine. The political Zionists were hoping it would become a state, and there was lots of diplomacy around that. Let me do the numbers here because I think these are kind of astounding. And then I'm going to answer the other question, which you can state again in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to focus on between 1880 and 1984, because this was when the huge migration into the United States took place. Our borders were closed in 1924. But until then, our borders were open in 1880, and it was a nation of immigrants. And listen to this. Okay, so in this time period, 1880 to 1924, there were 9.5 million Jews in all of Europe, including Eastern Europe. Listen to that number, 9.5 million. This is, of course, pre-Holocaust Europe, including Eastern Europe. During that period, 2 million of those Jews immigrated to the United States. And those are our ancestors in many cases, not all. Some of our ancestors came from other places, obviously, but a lot of American Jews came from Ashkenazic Eastern European backgrounds. So of the 9.5, 2 million end up in the United States. Now listen to the number of people who ended up in Palestine. In 1880, Palestine had 25,000 Jews out of the 9.5 million living in that part of the world. That is nothing, right? That's like a teeny tiny trickle. Now, a very small handful of those Jews were ultra-Orthodox Jews who had always had a presence in the Holy Land. Those people were actually against a nation state, and they still are in that world. The ultra-Orthodox Jews do not believe in the nation state. They won't serve in the military, and they are opposed to a nation because they think it's taking what should belong to God out of God's hands. So back then, there was always a sort of remnant of those Jews who had always been there and a little trickle who came. But most of those 25,000 Jews in 1880 were the very, very early political Zionists who were kind of trickling in. They actually mostly were like young, idealistic people who were like, we're going to revive what it means to be a Jewish man. We're going to go to the land and we're going to be farmers, because in Europe, Jews were kind of like sickly. Many of them had TB. They studied Talmud all day long in dark, germy yeshivas. And they were kind of effeminate by the standards of Western society. They were considered like not really men enough. And that's a Jewish stereotype, that Jewish men aren't manly enough and the women are like aggressive and bossy. And those are Jewish, dominant society Jewish stereotypes, but it actually comes from what was really happening in Eastern Europe. And these people were the outliers. But think of the numbers, 25,000 out of 9.5 million. So almost nobody's migrating to Palestine. And then here's how those numbers grow. At the beginning of World War I, there were 40,000 Jews in Palestine, so still minuscule numbers. They're a tiny fraction. They're 10% of the people who live in Israel. Most of the people there are Arabs. Before World War I, Jews are 10% of the population in Israel, and 90% is Arab. Even by the end of World War I, there's 60,000 Jews, like so tiny, tiny numbers. And even in 1931, which is before Hitler starts really oppressing and planning to annihilate the Jews, and there was a bigger migration then to the United States and to Israel. But in 1931, before Hitler starts that up, there was a total of 174,600 Jews in the land of Palestine, which is, if you still think about that, out of 9.5 million Jews, and you can see why Ahad Ha'am did not think you could relocate all the Jews. Like even with a vast international political Zionist effort to fund and train and support Jews moving to Palestine, they managed to get a few tens of thousands over there. It just was not a realistic plan for Jewish safety. And so, okay, that's where we are population-wise, which I just think it's really important to keep these numbers sort of in perspective, that Jews were a fraction of the population in Palestine. And it is growing, and that begins to threaten the Arabs, whose homes it is, who live there. Okay, Louisa, your question is next, or your comment, and then Ed.
Hang on a minute. I had to take myself off of mute.
You're good.
So this reminded me that, at least, and I apologize if I pronounced his name wrong, Buber was talking about the different sections like Kabbalah and Zionists, and changing the Zionists into the different sections that make up Judaism that we talk about today. It also reminded me that he was looking at it as left versus right, whereas he looked at the Zionists as right, and the political Zionists, and his version was more leftist. So that's what I found sort of interesting. And also I was thinking about the statements of city versus nation, and that God left us that Adam brought out that the land was left to us, or one of them brought out that the land was left to us, and it was up to what we cultivated, but it was still God's land.
Aha. Yeah. That's very interesting. Okay. Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm kind of struggling with a factual challenge. If I understand, Ahad Ha'am's position was that a large transfer of Jews to Palestine, except for unusual circumstances, was really impossible. But isn't it a factual reality that the Holocaust and subsequent to the Holocaust, the exclusion of Jewish immigration to other lands really created the exceptional circumstances that he couldn't foresee?
Yeah. I mean, even now, half the Jews in the world don't live in Israel and half do, roughly. So I think that's right. I'll look that up for our next class, what those exact numbers are. But yeah, there was certainly a need to physically keep Jews safe starting in the 1930s. But you can see how the dangers that Martin Buber was worried about have happened for the state of Israel. Like, we're not in such a great place right now with political Zionism. Israel's a tiny little nation alienated from the whole rest of the world, and people live in fear, and it's very militarized, and a lot of the dangers that these early spiritual Zionists predicted about having a nation state. So it's just a dilemma, because you need Jews to be safe, but you actually need everybody to be safe, right? You need all human beings to be safe. And the question is, to have that kind of safety, do you need nation states for every single ethnic group with borders and a military and defenses? And actually, that's proved to be pretty impossible if you look at like the Baltic states and the African states. It doesn't seem possible to have every single little ethnic group. So there seems like maybe there's a way where it actually has worked best for the Jews when we live in a society where everybody gets to be safe. And we're all committed to each other's safety and to having the backs of the minorities, so that Jews stand up for trans people and trans people stand up for Black people. And, there's just, I don't want to make it sound like these are discrete categories, because you could have a trans Black Jew, but I mean, just everybody has each other's back is what's actually resulted in the most Jewish safety. And yet we see, some people read the history differently, which is that because we didn't have a state by the 1930s, the Jews were slaughtered. But we do have a state now, and the Jews aren't very safe in the world. So I think these people we're studying today, complexify the questions. Like, how do you have both kind of material and spiritual safety? So I'm going to go back now. We can go back to spotlighting and finish up.
Rabbi Julie, can I just make one other statement?
Sure.
What I was going to say was, if you think about it, in today's world, even places that have nations are not safe. And I don't just mean Israel. You have factions in every country or every continent that are fighting against themselves.
Right. I mean, when you look at terrorism in this country, the biggest danger is white Christian nationalism. It's homegrown terrorism. And the FBI will tell you that. The military will tell you that. Like, that's the biggest danger of terrorism in this country right now, is from white Christian nationalism. That's who's murdering people in Charlottesville and, various mass shootings and whatever, or synagogue desecrations. And okay. I want to finish this little section here about Buber. So, like Ahad Ha'am, Buber saw Zionism as a chance for Jewish ethical renewal after centuries of exile. And he believed, also like Ahad Ha'am, that the return to the land was meaningful only if it was accompanied by moral transformation. if you're just going to go there and become the pharaoh to the people who already live there, there's no point. He wrote, Zion is wherever the ethical deed is done in the spirit of holiness. The ultimate test of Zionism is whether the Jewish state embodies responsibility before God. He calls God the divine thou. Like that's who we need to be in relationship with, is what God wants of us. The greatness of a people, he wrote, is measured not by its power, but by its moral stature. Buber, the big I thou prophet, said well-being is relational. It's harmony between the self, the community, and the other. The Jewish people's spiritual health depends on its ability to live ethically with others, and especially with the non-Jew. So if you look at what the purpose of being Jewish is, it's not just to be materially alive in your body. It's to live a holy ethical life, to sort of rise to the chosenness call to be God's people in the sense that we act ethically, especially with the non-Jew. And he emphasized shalom, peace, as an existential stance, like a commitment, not merely the absence of conflict. So one kind of so just a summary statement here. A Jewish state without Jewish ethics would be a house without a soul. And both Ahad Ha'am and Martin Buber made statements like that. Like, what is it? What's the purpose of Judaism? And if you end up with a state, but without Jewish ethics, you're like a house without a soul. And to both of them, the soul was way more important than what borders who lived in. So the issue was not to have success in sovereignty, but to have success in moral authenticity, like kind of morally being true to your calling as Jews. And then we need to ask, well, can collective Jewish life actually balance power and principle? Security and soul. And these thinkers really inform our understanding of our choices today. And I don't think the solutions are any easier for us than they were for those people at that time. I think that, my favorite quote, which is attributed to Socrates, is, "There is no solution. Seek it lovingly." And, we're in a really place where there is no obvious solution right now. There's not like a pathway or a blueprint forward. But I think the ideas of these thinkers are really, really important as this kind of Zionism, not just political Zionism, not a state for just the sake of having a state, but what does it mean to be an ethical people? And what does it mean to sort of sustain Judaism, not just the Jewish people? So that's the review of those thinkers for today. But I also have one other little section I want to do here, if that is okay. Are people still alive and well here for a few more minutes? Thank you all. I never mind talking, but I typically would make it more experiential and interactive, but I'm also really happy just to talk if people want to listen here. So I appreciate you being amazing participants in this way. So I want to take a leap back into Jewish history to say that these thinkers, Ahad Ha'am and Buber in particular, they knew Jewish history. And so they knew this piece of history that I'm about to review with us, which we also know. You all know the Hanukkah story, right? Everybody knows the Hanukkah story, that it is before Jesus. It's a couple hundred years before, 167 BCE. The Jews are living under Greek domination at that time. And there's this little town in Modin, right, where the actual rulers are called Seleucids. They're kind of Syrian Greeks. And the Syrian Greeks want us, the Maccabees, to bow down to their naked Greek statue that was a symbol of virility, and kind of that was their religion, was to worship the body, especially the male athletic body. And Judah Maccabee won't bow down, and Mattathias won't bow down, and they become guerrilla warriors, and they go into the mountains to sort of actually they run through villages forcibly circumcising the Jewish people, trying to get the Jews to be sort of Jews and not Greeks. And they have their way of doing that. But not everybody knows what happened after that. We know the Maccabees won. So the Maccabees win, and then they become, they're of the Hasmonean family. So it becomes the Hasmonean dynasty. And all of a sudden, they're running their own country. They're no longer being subject to Syrian, Greek, Seleucid domination. Seleucid meaning Selucid or something like that. I don't think I spelled that exactly right, but Seleucid with an S. So Seleucid, Seleucid. Okay, but we're no longer under the Seleucids. We're now the Hasmonean dynasty back there before Jesus was born in Palestine, what becomes called Palestine under the Roman Empire. And it did not go well for the Jews to rule the Jews. This was considered a very low point in Jewish history. I mean, it was exciting that we kicked out the Seleucids and became the Hasmonean dynasty. It was exciting at first. I mean, you have to admit that was kind of an idealistic liberation struggle, those Maccabees in their own way. I mean, you could also say they were fanatics and they were very violent and they forced other Jews to do it their way. But on the positive side, they believed in something and they won it, and it was a freedom struggle. But then when they became a political dynasty and they had their own state, so to speak, I mean, it was kind of before you had nation states, but they ruled their own land as the Hasmonean dynasty. They weren't dominated by anybody else. All of a sudden, the Jews were in charge of the Jews. Well, they had a lot of religious zeal, and they consolidated their power. They were pretty expansionist, so they took over the places on their borders. They then merged the priesthood, which ran the temple, with the kingship. And always before in Judaism, there had been a triangle of power, sort of checks and balances. There had been the priests, the kings, and the prophets. If you picture a triangle like that, the priests running the holy rites, the king in charge of the military and protection, and the prophets challenging people to actually be ethical and to live good lives. Well, these guys merged the priest and the king. So that was a kind of truncating of the checks and balances. And they ended up in a civil war in 103 BCE that lasted about 40 years. They did a lot of forced conversions, very cruel and very corrupt. And so eventually in 63 BC, before Jesus, basically before Christ, in 63, the Roman Empire comes in and takes over to solve the civil war that's going on. It's sort of like how the United States ends up getting called into like African nations having civil wars, and the CIA will go in and kind of do something the United States thinks will be better. The United States has done that all over the world, South America, Central America, many, many places, Indonesia and Africa. And so the Roman Empire did that. So the Roman Empire then takes over. It took over because our Jewish state was having a civil war between each other, the different parts of our own Jewish state, which some people have thought Israel today is on the verge of civil war between the different factions. So anyway, and from then on, the Romans had sort of puppet rulers and the Jews lost sovereignty. So as you know, with the Hanukkah story, The rabbis looking back knew this history. They knew that the Hasmoneans were not a light unto the nations. They were a disaster, and they were the Jewish sovereigns in Jewish land. And so the rabbis, we've talked about this at Hanukkah, the rabbis basically said about the Hanukkah story, oh, no, it's not really about a military victory. It's not about becoming sovereign. No. The Hanukkah story is about light. It's about the miracle of light and of kind of believing in transformation. And that's how we get the story of the candles and, the oil that was discovered and it lasted extra days. And now we celebrate light. We don't celebrate like military brutality at Hanukkah, even though the original texts and history were totally about military might and having sovereignty. And actually, I've taught this stuff at Hanukkah before, so it's a little familiar, I hope. In Israel in modern times, they resurrected the military part of the Hanukkah story. Like, yeah, we can have military might. We have an ancient story that shows we can win, because they now have the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and it's an occupying army in Palestine of other people who are kept under, 6 checkpoints to get to work and armed guards everywhere and barbed wire and lots of arrests just in case for detention. And just, it's a military occupation, and it has been for a very long time, since 1967. So when we look back at sort of Jewish models of sovereignty, it's not very impressive. And I could go even farther back in history, but that's a familiar story, is the Maccabees. Mostly Jews haven't been sovereign over our own nation. Mostly in our history, that's not what we've been. And that's how we developed sort of the ethical, moral teachings that come from the bottom of a system where you don't have the power. People who have power like to protect their power, but Jews didn't have power. Jews had kind of spiritual power. And that's how we invented a religion and a worldwide people that did bring light unto the nations. If you look at everything Jews have contributed, it wasn't because we had a nation. It's because we had a real culture of learning and of caring and of solidarity and, study and we've managed to contribute a huge, huge amount as the Jewish people to humanity, but not because we had a nation. So let's stop there and once again go back to community view and see just open discussion now. What are your thoughts about all this? There is really no right answer. These things are really, really complicated questions. Nationalism, Jewish safety, the meaning of Judaism, the purpose of Jews, How do you put it all together into a weave? Paul.
Sorry about that. Well, first of all, this is fascinating. And you answered my question because I wondered if we were, as Jews, ever aggressors, because I hear about we were always put down wherever we were. It's like, I couldn't picture an army of Woody Allens, who were going to do battle, right? And so everything you said was really true, but I'd never heard that part of the Hanukkah story because it turned into the menorah. So I think what's tricky now is we meaning Israel, are seen as aggressors, and we have aggressed. We have actually done some serious things that were not done before, and I understand even there maybe that gets talked about. Because we couldn't create this, Israel could not create the safety with things like suicide bombers. And I know when I came years ago, when I went to Israel, there was a lot more reciprocity with the Arabs. There was a lot more give and flow between borders and all that. And I see now that it's difficult. So the hardest thing is just realizing that, going forward, I don't know if they will acquiesce and take away that aggressive stance, because the other hadn't worked. And it almost sounds like when you describe all these aspects before, especially Eastern Europe, we were always victimized. We were always violated. We were always expected to acquiesce. And so I'm so torn now because I understand the need to balance, the need to think through your actions, to think about consequences, to think, but I also, and the effects of what we've seen in the near past in Israel and in Gaza is just devastating. It's actually short-circuited my way of understanding Israel. But I still see from what you've described and everything we've been through that the way we did it before couldn't possibly continue. So hopefully in just what you're explaining, something rises from it that has heart and spirit and compassion to go forward. But it's everything you just described, it explains to me why we're all messed up, because we didn't get opportunity as a people very often, if ever, in the past. And so we're left as a, we don't forget slavery's in there too, so we don't exactly transcend that and feel safe. I think that magic word is safety, because without safety, you can't.
Let's Phil. Thank you for that. That's really, really comprehensive there. Phil's. I just want to make space for a few other people to weigh in.
I just wanted to respond to that because I'd add to it that you have a new kind of threat. I don't think ever before in all of these past times they had the mechanisms to be such a threat as Hamas can be today. There's certain primitive aspects like building tunnels and all that, but also the technological aspects of it and the international cooperation between the terrorist organizations. It's a huge enemy.
Yeah.
And who can blame Israel for trying to survive
and stay safe?
So it's a very different question now of safety, I think, and it raises new moral questions.
Yeah. So I just want to say that's why Martin Buber's kind of I-thou dialogical perspective is so moving to me, because he also looks at it through the eyes of the Palestinians, which back then it was the Arabs. Because the reason those Palestinians are trying to build tunnels and do suicide bombs and hate the Jewish Israelis is that they are being, their land was taken and they're being kept in a prison, an outdoor prison, and, occupied in the West Bank. So if you see it through their eyes and are willing to find a way for two people to share the same land, like two peoples love the same land, and if you can't find some solution that works for both of them, the Jews won't be safe. Because at the root of why the Palestinians do aggressive things is as a reaction to the Jews taking over the land and being occupiers. So somehow you have to be able to see the world through, you have to have dual narrative. You have to be able to hold dual narratives. The Jews and the Palestinians see it differently. But you have to be able to see the other's point of view to come up with some solution to share that land. Like no one's going away. Israel's not going away, or the Jews certainly are not going away. The Palestinians are not going away. So how are you going to share the land? And that's Martin Buber says you have to figure it out together. Like you're going to have to listen to each other's pain and histories and hurt places, because that's what motivates them to act like they're acting. Jews occupy because Jews are scared. Not because Jews are evil. Jews are very, scared, and they go and try to destroy the tunnels, and that kills tens of thousands of innocent people. But it's because Jews are scared. If the Palestinians can't listen to the Jewish need for safety and security, you're not going to end up with a solution. But if the Jews can't listen to the Palestinian need for freedom, so you could really, Martin Buber, I think, is really the seed to something for the future, but it's probably not the moment right this minute where people are calm enough to sit down together and do that. Let's make room for one or two more comments. If there are one or two more comments. And I hope people will keep
Rabbi Julie?
questions. Yes, Joe.
Rabbi Julie? Yeah, I just had one comment. I believe that Judaism and Islam both have this precept, belief, whatever, be kind to the stranger. Because I'm guessing because the people that founded those religions realized that people can lots of times not be kind to the stranger. So the emphasis in their religions was to be kind to the stranger. And I think
because the reason there are those ethical moral teachings is that when human beings are hurt, we go into fight, flight, we have fear responses, and that's what Israel's in right now as a nation. And that's what the Palestinians are in as a people. And certainly there's
I guess that's what I was saying. It's like the precepts of both religions are in a way to act opposite the way things are going now.
That's right. It's to bring something else into the mix. That's why it's a spiritual teaching, an ethical teaching, because it's beyond what is your nature you might do. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. There's a lot of Islamophobia in the world. There also probably still are a lot of kind of cultural imperialist things like people thinks the other one's backwards or less than. And, there's just like a lot of human misunderstanding and hate. Nevertheless, two people have to share the same land. So no one's going anywhere. And these spiritual, ethical, cultural teachers can be part of a foundation for a Zionism that works for all. So you don't have to be really, okay. I think I better stop there because we're running out of time. Let's close with our song for learning together. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. The reading assignment for next time will go out. Diane, Bobby is scanning it, and I think is getting it to you today, if that hasn't already happened, right, Bobby?
It has not.
Oh, okay. So everybody will get the links to the reading assignment. You can also just buy the book, The Necessity of Exile. And I have a quick announcement. Bobby, maybe you do too, but I just want to make sure everybody knows about our celebration for Enid Adler, age 90. This coming Friday at our Shabbat services. The actual service is in person and on Zoom. So everybody can come in and celebrate Enid, but also there will be an in-person afterwards kind of special oneg dessert moment for people who are there in person next Friday night. Bobby, anything else?
Good. I'm going to dispense with my usual announcements because we have so much going on. It's just best if you go to the calendar and check it out. But one thing I will say is that council meeting is tomorrow night, and I encourage any members who would like to attend, and they can participate in that kind of thing.
Okay, everybody, take care.
And thank you, Rabbi Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,